Well, this morning we're going to engage a new sermon conversation called Grooves. And let me just give a couple of modifiers for the conversation itself. This is one of the only times that we're going to deviate in our two different campuses and have two different sermon conversations because I simply wanted to share this on my own. In some way, this is a bit of a reveal of the family secret recipe for me because this is going to reveal a bit of my pastoral ministry, my philosophy of ministry. But something has happened to your pastor over the past few months. In ministry, we tend to seesaw back and forth between rest and diligence, or rest and being deliberate and being direct and being aggressive. And I feel like we've had a season of rest where we've enjoyed life together and things of that nature. But I felt this call from God earlier this summer. It's time to impress more of who you are in the midst of Advent Presbyterian Church. And so I want to share for the next 6 weeks, and I didn't want Pastor Don or anyone else to have the burden of sharing from my heart and the things that I engage with as the life of a pastor. So for the next 6 weeks, I'm going to be here at Cordova 6 straight weeks. So if you'd rather listen to somebody else, you know where I'm going to be, and so you can make your travel plan elsewise. But I think more than anything else, I have an incredible burden since I've been in ministry. I became a Christian at the age of 16. All that was told to me is that I needed to somehow deal with God before I died. And then for many years, nobody told me what to do next. Nobody told me about what the life of faith was ahead other than to read your Bible and to pray every day. Nobody told me the different contours and shapes and twists and turns of this faith. And so I've always been on a journey to find out, is there some way to communicate the larger picture of what it means to be a Christian from the time that we're younger to the time in which we get near the end? And so all I want to do for the next 6 weeks is to reveal something that's worked for me and something that I've used in ministry and something that I use again and again during pastoral counseling because I think it's going to equip us for the sake of doing the work of the church. I'm going to do this for 3 reasons. The first one is this. It's simply a window into who I am. I began preaching nearly every week right after I got out of college, and I was 21 years old at the time, and I was hired by a church to preach in the Gen X service. So the music was at 105 decibels, the lights were off, and it was in a gym, so the sound was bouncing around everywhere. And we all assumed that all the young people would go to that service because there was a young preacher, it was loud, it was dark, and so nothing but young people would go there. But a few months in, more than just 20-somethings were showing up to worship. And so since I was their primary preaching pastor, I'd get these emails and these phone calls, and people would say, hey, could we get together for coffee? I've got a really tough decision at work, or I've got a tough decision raising my kids, and I'd like to have your input. But I'm like 21 years old. I don't have kids. And so my punchline for all these counseling appointments was, you should probably just read your Bible and pray more, and just figure it out from there. Which there's nothing wrong with that, but I remember after about 6 or 8 times, maybe a dozen times doing that, I said to myself, I don't want to do that anymore. I want to have a better conversation there. And so I've been on a search for this, maybe it's an imperfect model, but something that could help start the conversation for anyone who's been a Christian for a short time or for a long time, at any given point in their life before God. Could I at least give a framework to engage in that conversation to go a bit further? And so I searched far and wide, and I finally came across one that I really enjoyed. It's something I actually swiped from somebody else, and I started using it, and it's field tested. I mean, every time, about 8 out of 10 times that I use this model, and I draw these drawings as I grapple with somebody in the midst of their pastoral counseling issue, all of a sudden they get really quiet, and their eyes get really big, and they're going, are you like dialed into Google or something? How do you know what's going on in my life? You're like reading my soul mail here. And I'm like, no, actually, I've stolen something from a Roman Catholic priest. I'm not really looking into your life at all. And so I've borrowed this, admittedly, from Father Richard Rohr, who has dealt with thousands and thousands and thousands of people in the life of his ministry, in the correctional system, in their young adult life, and through different parishes. And he's come up with a couple of drawings because he's seen that there's a typical trajectory of the human soul from beginning to end. And there's some critical missteps that happen when there's a fork in the road. And so it's an imperfect model, but as somebody told me along the way, my imperfect model is better than one that you don't have. So let's at least start there. So the reason I want to share this over the next few weeks is because it gets a window into who I am, to share the family recipe of how I see the life of faith from beginning to end. The second thing is because I think a good religion, I think Christianity is the best at this, helps us to translate and to transform all of life experiences. Things happen in the midst of life, and we tend to try to find an answer of why these things are happening. And so a good religion will give us at least some sort of answer, at least a partial answer, so that we're not left wondering, why is this happening to me, and what's going to happen next? But what I love about the Christian story is that not only does it translate life experiences, but it transforms us into the image of Christ. It doesn't just give us easy answers to tough questions, but it gives us a journey with the faithful God. And so I think what this model is also going to do is that through the twists and turns of life, it'll give us some translation, but it'll also lead us into the next step. And it's important for us to do so. I've got a friend named Jen who's also in ministry, and she's also a runner. And there was one time she was training for a half marathon, and for whatever reason, halfway through her training plan, she started having some knee pain and soreness. And so as a runner, you begin to try to address that in a few different ways. Maybe add some more stretching in, or change the shoes, or maybe get some insoles, which are ultimately not worth anything, I guess, in distance running. And so she went through all those steps. She did more stretching, and she tried some nutrition tips, and she tried some different shoes, and she got some insoles, but it never went away. So she finally went to her primary care doctor at the end of this process. And she said, I got this knee pain, and it's come out of nowhere. And he asked her a bizarre question. He says, have you been overseas recently? She's like, yes, I just went to Africa for a missions trip. And he started to feel in her abdomen area, and he says, I think that you've got a parasite. And that parasite's causing your body to overcompensate, and in your running motion, you're putting more pressure on that one foot. So he wrote her a prescription, and she admittedly wasn't hopeful that this was actually going to help her. But when she took care of the parasite, it took care of the knee problem. Here's the point. Many times in the Christian life, we deal with the symptoms, and we don't go to the root. Okay, we have an anger issue. We've got an irritability with people at work, or we're snapping at the kids, or we're snapping at the spouse. We think it's just an anger issue, but maybe there's something else that's going on, something that the gospel needs to go all the way down to the depths to address. So what this model will attempt to do is not just to help us to identify the symptoms that we might have, but to go down to the very bottom. But here's a word of warning. Those conversations about things in the depth of who we are sometimes very messy and sometimes very painful. So we've got a decision to make. Do we want to simply manage the issues in our lives, whether they're taken care of or not? Or do we want to have some deep soul work that's done before God and allow the gospel to transform us deeply? That takes some time. That takes some critical conversations. It ultimately takes an invitation for God to do that great work within us. And so that's going to be one of the things that this sermon series is going to try to address. But the last thing I think it's going to address is to renew our mission as a church. And for us as Christians, have you ever noticed sometimes Christians can make a big deal out of really small things in the life of the church? Now, I'm not saying at Advent Presbyterian Church, not at this church, but in other places. Probably a Baptist church somewhere, I don't know. That there could be a big argument about small, minuscule things, and there's committees, and there's long conversation, there's hateful emails, and there's passive-aggressive sighs and remarks, and there's meetings after meetings, and there's alliances and allegiances created in order to kind of have our thing win over this thing. I just know sometimes Jesus, when he sees some of these mountains that are really molehills, he shrugs his shoulders, probably he says, listen, y'all, the tomb is empty. Let's get over this. There are bigger fish to fry than this. That's what I think this sermon series is also going to do, is to remind us we have a greater task than sometimes the minuscule things that we try to focus on in the life of the church, and we'll be able to move on into greater and deeper work. One of the passages that's foundational to my pastoral ministry is from Galatians chapter 4, verse 19, where the Apostle Paul, as he's dealing with a church that's struggling to get along with him and to get along with one another, he says this, and I love this image. He says, my dear children, for whom I am again in the pains of childbirth until Christ is formed within you. You were to ask the Apostle Paul, what's ministry like? He's like, it's like carrying a baby at 8 or 9 months pregnant. It's full of potential and excitement, but it's also full of pain. And sure, we've had many mothers in this room and some expecting mothers currently, and you know what I'm talking about. There's their tension towards the end of pregnancy where you cannot wait to meet this baby, and you can't wait for the pain to be over. But you ever notice expecting mamas how they'll hold their bellies with endearment and with fondness? The Apostle Paul says, even though we're struggling right now, I still hold you with fondness until you're fully formed in Christ. Do you not realize that one of the chief tasks of being a Christian is to keep souls around us? It is not just to keep after our own soul, which is one of the positions of being a Christian, but to also keep in mind that souls are being formed all around us. Just like our physical bodies are being shaped by what we eat or don't eat and exercise that we do or not do every single moment of every single day, stuff is happening to us that's shaping our soul, and things are happening to us that's shaping our soul. Do we realize that how we respond to our children in a moment of tension is shaping their soul? We need to be reminded that how we respond to coworkers in a tense season is keeping their soul, or it's putting their soul in languish. How we respond to the quirky thing our neighbor does is keeping or making their soul turn to languish. The waitress that we're going to belittle after service today, perhaps, because she upcharged us on a side of ranch and we weren't aware of it, even though it's only $1.50, the conversation that we have with her potentially keeps her soul. Perhaps what this sermon series will do as we go through what the map looks like for a lifelong discipleship, it'll clue us into where our kids are at, where our neighbors are at, where our spouse is at, where our coworkers are at. It's going to give us some intel on how to be more faithful to their journey and where they are at this current moment. So I've got some high hopes for the next few weeks ahead of us. But this is a governing task of the church, to keep one another's souls. So for this, I want to go to Luke chapter 16 and share quickly a parable that Jesus tells. And it's a peculiar parable because it's a parable about what happens to a couple individuals after they die. Let me just say something admittedly. I think we want this parable to say more than it actually was intended to. There's something about American Christianity where we have this great fascination with what is it going to be like after we die? What is it technically and exactly going to be like on the other side? And so Jesus tells a story of a rich man and a guy named Lazarus who die, and they go to two different places after they pass away. And we want it to say perhaps more than it intends to say. But we got to be reminded that in this part of Luke's gospel, Jesus is traveling and he's trying to train his followers for the ministry ahead. They're going to be scattered from their homelands. They're going to be strangers in foreign places. And they're going to be given the task to be his witnesses to the ends of the earth. And so Jesus is trying to confront some embedded religious mindsets that will prevent them in the way of faithfulness. So with that in mind, we can actually engage with this parable with a little bit more of sincerity and with a little bit more humility. We see in Luke 16, starting in verse 19, that Jesus introduces us to two characters. The first one is a rich man, and there's a couple things about him. That he's dressed in purple clothing, and he lives in luxury. He eats what he wants, and he gets to go and do the business that he wants to do. His life is not ordered by anyone. And Jesus is particular here because in that day and time, the Romans really tried to keep score of who could actually wear the purple robes because that signified royalty or the brass of the establishment. So you could not pose and wear purple if you didn't belong. This guy belonged in the 1%. He has it made. Jesus doesn't even give him a name. He just calls him rich man. And we know exactly who he is. And he's able to do what he wants. He's got a table full of food. He's got business to do out there. He's got some important people to go see. But then we meet the absolute opposite of rich man, a guy named Lazarus. Lazarus, his name's translated, means the one whom God helps. And this is kind of hysterical because Lazarus is completely different than rich man. He is crippled, and he's been thrown at the gate of the rich man, and the dogs are licking his sores, and Lazarus is longing for the food that would even fall from rich man's table for his next meal. You couldn't get more two polar opposite people in one place at one time. But a couple details about what might be going on here culturally. Some translations say that Lazarus was thrown at rich man's gate. There's a suggestion that perhaps Lazarus was a servant in rich man's field, and he got injured during his time of service. So instead of going to the temple and begging at the temple for alms to keep all the riffraff out of the temple, they would take Lazarus, who belonged to rich man, they would throw him at his gate, and they would say, this is rich man's responsibility. This is not the temple's responsibility. But notice what rich man does. He doesn't address the issues that Lazarus has. In fact, I think we can, with a little bit of license here, fill in the gaps. He has to step over Lazarus to go about his business every single day. Even though from the time of his boyhood, he would have heard from the first 5 books of the Old Testament that you don't turn away from your neighbor, that you don't turn away from the needs of those who belong to you. But he steps over and he goes about his business. Culpepper, who's one of the theologians who gives comment over this passage, he says, their lives seem to be divided by a table and by a gate. So as we start this story, we get this interesting picture. This is going to be a story about how you treat others who don't belong at your table and who exist outside of your gate. How do you treat people who are underneath you? And so we get to scene 2 when they both pass away. And when they both pass away, this is kind of a humorous part of the story, because there's 3 exchanges between rich man and Abraham. We're told that when Lazarus dies, he goes from there to Abraham's side, and we know from some extra biblical material that those who were martyrs for God's cause went to Abraham's side, supposedly after they passed away. And so somehow Lazarus is honored in the afterlife, but then we see that rich man has a different experience altogether. He is in Hades, where he's experiencing great torment. But there's 3 exchanges between rich man and Abraham. Notice how rich man doesn't address Lazarus, he addresses Abraham. The first thing that he wants Lazarus to do is to, just like it was when we were in our lived experience, can Lazarus serve me? Can he dip his finger in some water and place it on my tongue, because I am just parched in this place of fire and agony and torment. But Abraham says, no, there's a great chasm between you, between us, and we can't cross over, and you can't come to us. When rich man realizes that he's not able to have Lazarus serve him in that way, he continues to plead with Abraham. But something worth noting here is this idea of being in torment. The original Greek word for torment is the word basanos. And there's some different collective group words that are associated with this word of being in torment. One of them is really interesting, and I think it adds a bit of flavor to this story. In the first century world, if you're going to offer money to the money changers, they wanted to make sure that the coins you offered were authentic. So they would take a stone, a sharp stone, called a basanos, and they would scratch the top of it to see if it's a legit coin, a real coin, or a counterfeit. It's simply with a veneer of gold and with common stone underneath it. It's kind of like, remember we used to give 20s at the convenience store? They used to take that highlighter and I didn't ever feel like that did anything, but they could pick out the counterfeit from the real. And this is the first century highlighter. And so as rich man is in agony on the other side, sure, he's experiencing some physical torment, but perhaps something deeper is going on. Perhaps the basanos stone is scratching over his soul again and again and again and again. And it's revealing again and again and again and again that he's fake. That he's had a veneer of faithfulness. But it's not real. You ever been caught in a lie before? Imagine that feeling compounded that you cannot escape again and again and again and again and again. That sounds an awful lot like torment. This guy had all at his disposal. He could do whatever he wanted. But it seemed like he mismanaged what faithfulness would look like to someone in his situation. And so what happened on the other side was the revelation again and again that he did not live life as it was intended. He did not play the game well. And he's in agony because he cannot go back and fix it. But the closing scene, I think, is really important too, because as rich man can't get any help when he's there in torment, he asks one more request of Father Abraham. He said, Father Abraham, my brothers need to hear. They need to know what's going to be ahead for them if they don't change their ways. Can you send Lazarus back from the dead? I've got a great idea. Allow Lazarus to go back to life. He could go to my brothers, and he could tell them what I'm experiencing. But Abraham says, no, they have Moses and the prophets. If they're not going to believe them, they would not believe even if someone was raised from the dead. There's an interesting chill in the air when Jesus tells this story. That there's a system of way of living that you think you're living life well, but you're actually living life poorly. And this rich man's brothers was caught into a system where they could not embrace faithfulness. They did not know the right way forward. So they needed an intervention. This is what Culpepper says about this story. To many who heard the parable, this turn of events would have come as a surprise, for it was believed that blessings in this life were a sign of God's favor, while illness, poverty, and hardship were signs of God's displeasure. A just God would not do otherwise. How could a beggar go to heaven? So Jesus tells this tale where expectations are turned on their head. And perhaps a great question is lingering in his crowd as he tells it. How are you managing what God has given you? Are you living life well? I wonder if we've asked that question this morning. I wonder if we've asked that question because in our modern culture, we are not asked again and again, how do you want to be? What image do you want to be? Who do you want to be at the very end of your story? What we're told is to tune into what we desire and define the thing that we can buy that could quench that desire. Rarely is anyone giving us the chance to say, have you considered who you want to be at the end of your race? But what we should be thankful for in the Christian tradition is that this has been a hallmark question from the very beginning. What does lifelong faithfulness look like? But there's a lot at stake for us to grapple with this type of question. I heard a story once of a guy named George Bell, and the New York Times did an expose on people who were dying in New York City, but it took people several days or even weeks to recognize that they were gone. And this is a picture of George Bell's apartment at the time he passed away. George passed away, and it was several days, up to 2 weeks, before anyone recognized that he was gone. There was traffic tickets, parking tickets piling up underneath his windshield wiper, and so people tried to make some connections, and they realized that someone needed to go check on him. And so by the time authorities got into his apartment, they couldn't recognize that it was him. It took the coroner with tests to realize that it was George Bell and to figure out how he passed away. The saddest thing, though, is that there were no family members to come to his funeral. They tried to reach out through his will, through next of kin, and nobody returned calls, nobody returned responses. And so it was several months later when George was laid to rest, only 3 people came to his funeral, and those people worked at the mortuary that took care of his needs. As the reporter began to dial into his story a bit, he tells this story of how George used to have a lot of friends, and he used to have dinner parties, and he would cook for people, and he was involved in the community. But over time, he began to pull away from loved ones. He began to pull away from friendships. And he lived the remainder of his life in isolation. All of his things were sold off for a meager sum of money that was given to people of a will that he made 30 years before. They were probably surprised that they got a check, that they still qualified to be in George's will. We could say this as a conclusion to his story. George Bell died before he passed away. He took missteps. He backed away from life. He phoned it in. And he didn't have the appropriate, the good, the true, the beautiful end that God desires for us. I want this to put this next to a person who had a great end, in my opinion. This is Grandpa Bob Skillen, Blue-Eyed Bobby. Grandpa Bob, my dad's dad, was born in a meager farming community. As you can see in this top left picture, he wore overalls every day of his life. He farmed ground, and he loved to go to school, and he was a great athlete. He wanted everything. In fact, his box score of one of his basketball games from high school is in the top right, and you can't read it, but let's take my word for it. There were 38 total points scored in that for his team's side, and he scored 22 of them. He's like Russ Westbrook, of his high school team. But he was a great baseball player. There's an urban legend that as scouts from the major league were crisscrossing the United States looking for hidden talent, that a scout from the New York Yankees landed in Norwich, Kansas, just some small dusty farm town, because they heard that a really quick shortstop named Skillen is someone they need to look at. Grandpa went to college and he had dreams of perhaps being a lawyer or something like that. He was pretty intelligent. He got broken up in his college career because he'd spent some time in the service. He came back from the service, and what I enjoyed about Grandpa is that he gave his duty to his country, but he didn't big league anybody with it. He didn't prove that he was more of a man because of his service. He served, he did his time, and then he moved on because he knew that more of life was yet to be lived. In fact, it was only after he passed away did we even realize the stuff that he got into when he was in the service. He came back and he started a family, and he was a teacher, he was a coach, and he was a farmer. To make ends meet in that family of 7, sometimes he taught driver's education. And one day he was so exhausted from all of his work that he fell asleep while the kids were driving the car, and they drove all the way through the state of Oklahoma until he woke up. And then it was a long, quiet ride back home. Yeah. He was a deacon in his Baptist church. He was a Sunday school teacher, and I love sitting through Grandpa's lectures because he could make you laugh, he could make you think, and people were eager to chime in and try to argue with him, but he never tried to big league them or to say that he knew more about the scriptures than they did. Grandpa's, one of his greatest things was coaching, and he had a winning record at everything. Even if it was girls basketball, boys basketball, football, whatever it was, Grandpa won at everything. I asked him one time when he was being inducted into the Kansas Coaching Hall of Fame, how did he do so well? And he says, I just had really good kids. But he went to a 1A school. He coached at a 1A school where you have like 8 people to play football. And that's all you have. So for him to say, every year I can look at who I have and I can make the most out of them, and to put it back on the kids that he got to coach was something that was awe-inspiring. When it's time for him to retire, they wanted to give him a retirement gift. So the local school board went to a local woodworker who could make fine pins out of wood, and they began to tell about a teacher who was retiring, and they wanted to get an order prepared on this date. And the guy said, well, can I ask, who's retiring? Who is this? And the guy said, Bob Skillen. And the guy took his favorite pen from his own pocket, and he said, I want you to give him this one. Because only the best for Bob Skillen. His favorite thing was to gather his grandkids together. On the bottom left, he's gathering us for the Christmas reindeer games that he did. He would create all these questions, pop trivia and all this stuff to try to fool us. Like he would say, who was buried in Grant's tomb and how many animals of each kind did Moses bring on the ark? Just so you know, Moses wasn't on the ark. It was Noah. I learned that 7 years old, okay? But he looked forward to it every single year. And the bottom right was the last time I saw Grandpa. Grandma had already passed. He had to have some emergency surgery, and he got out of a rehab hospital just so he could have one more Christmas with his grandkids. And we spent time together. We didn't talk about KU Jayhawk basketball. We didn't joke with one another. We talked about serious things. He talked about life, and he talked about faith, and he talked about family. He hugged each of my kids. He whispered something in Ginger's ear that she hasn't told me yet. 3 days after that picture, Grandpa joined Grandma for the reward of their salvation. I've got an image of who I want to be at the end. Do you? Have you and I thought about it? Or is it just the paycheck to paycheck, month by month, day after day? Have we actually thought that our soul is being formed? That we can't make up all the hard work in the short time at the end? That it's all right now? My hope over the next few weeks is that we capture an enthusiasm for the whole life of discipleship. And instead of letting life happen and perhaps mismanaging it like rich man in our story from Luke 16, that we have an enthusiasm and an interest for what's going on today and what we're going to be like at the end. I'm going to close with a story. My kids are reading the Wing Feather Saga series with Ginger at night. It's a great Christian fiction series. Ginger reads to them, and it's a neat story of Christian truth that's woven into some fiction. The big story is that there's a great kingdom that's under threat from some lesser beings called fangs. If you're going to pick lesser beings, you might as well call them fangs. But fangs are wreaking havoc upon the known world, and they're taking people with them as prisoners. And once they take you, it's hard to come back. And there's a place at the edge of the dark waters where if they get you there, you cannot come back. It's a story of a royal family, and the king has passed away. So one of the young sons, his name is Kalmar, but everybody calls him Tink. He's the new king, but he's young, and he's still trying to figure things out. In the second book, he's apprehended by the fangs, and his transition is beginning, and he's headed towards a place of no return. So his family rushes to save him, and his brother jumps into the waters and embraces him, even though Tink turns on him and harms him in the process. But they pull him out of the waters, and they bring him home. But the damage has been done. He doesn't know who he is. He barely says an intelligible word. He's a threat and he's a danger to everyone around him. But his family takes the great risk of keeping him in the family and believing that he could make a change. And so every night and every morning, his mom comes into the room where he's staying, and she says, "What is your name?" And he usually growls back at her, and he snaps back at her, and he has an outburst of anger. But in the bed next to him, his brother Janner is telling him stories of what they did when they were younger kids. All the adventures that they had gone on. But it seems like Tink is simply ignoring all the attempts to try to reach him. But one day things change. His mom comes in the room. She says, "What's your name?" And he says, "My name is Kalmar, the High King of Anira." Friends, I think some of us have lost our way. We've forgotten our name. We've defaulted on our story. But the good news is it's not too late. The God who doesn't leave the one behind is speaking, and he's searching, and he wants you back. He wants me back. And so over the next 6 weeks, I simply want to give a framework for how you and I can engage in that process. There's actually a couple drawings. Go ahead and throw those drawings up on the screen. That looks like onside kick coverage for your favorite college football team. But I promise you that these drawings tell a story. And I've seen it again and again bring people back. And my prayer over the next few weeks is that some of us find our way back.